In July of 1987, two identical boys slipped through a cabin window and into the rain. No one saw them leave. No one saw where they went. But by morning, their canoe was floating upside down at the far end of Mirror Lake, and the camp where they vanished would never open its gates again. 30 years passed without answers, until the postcard came. 3 words typed on a warped old card that smelled like smoke and mildew. Come find us. Before we begin, hit subscribe to help bring stories like this into the light, because some names should never stay missing. My name's Raymond Dunn. I'm 52 now, retired from the sheriff's department, living quiet up in western Massachusetts. I don't talk much about the summer I spent as a junior counselor at Mirror Lake Camp. Most people who worked there don't. But when that card showed up on my kitchen table last fall, no return address, just a faded photo of the lake, I knew I'd never really left that place behind. Back then, I was 17. I'd taken the job because I needed the money, and the camp director, Mrs. Price, had known my mother from church. Mirror Lake wasn't fancy, just a string of cabins, a rickety dock, and a mess hall with a leaky roof, but it had a good reputation. Families from all over New Hampshire and Vermont sent their kids there. We ran swim drills, taught crafts, sang songs around the fire. It was simple, predictable, safe. Or at least, that's what we thought. The Cole twins. Brandon and Bradley were campers in Cabin 7 that year. 11 years old. Same sandy blonde hair, same grin. The only way to tell them apart was a small scar over Bradley's left eyebrow. They were close, the kind of close you only see in twins. Always together, always looking for the next adventure. Their sister Ellie was at camp too. She was 13, quiet, polite. Cabin 4. She looked out for them. I remember that clearly. Nothing big happened at first. Just small things. The kids whispered about counselors sneaking out at night, about something called the Midnight Pact. At the time, I thought it was just campfire gossip, the usual stuff older kids make up to scare each other. But some of the counselors really were acting strange, tense, secretive. One afternoon, I walked into the canoe shed and found Derek Michaels, one of the older staff, talking low with a girl named Marissa Coyle. They stopped when they saw me, told me it was nothing. But Marissa looked worried, and she didn't come to breakfast the next morning. Then there was the lake itself. Mirror Lake was always calm, still as glass most mornings. But that summer it felt different, like it was watching. On July 12th, I remember seeing the twins sitting by the fire after dinner. Bradley was laughing. Brandon wasn't. They were passing something back and forth, I couldn't see what, and when I walked over, they got quiet. I figured they were just tired, or planning a prank. But the next morning, Ellie asked me if I'd seen her brothers after lights out. She said she'd heard them whispering. Said something didn't feel right. That was the first time I felt it too, that cold prickle at the base of my neck. I brushed it off. Then came the storm. It hit just after midnight. Fast, heavy. By morning, the lake had risen nearly a foot, and the Cole twins were gone. That's where it started. And everything that came after, it never really left us. I didn't sleep much the night the storm came. The wind hit the windows around midnight, and by morning the lake had swallowed the shore. Everything felt waterlogged and heavy, like the land itself had gone quiet. No whistles blew for breakfast. No voices echoed from the field. I remember stepping outside Cabin 5 just before 6. The grass was flattened, the air sharp with that electric post-storm smell, mud and pine, and the metallic edge of rain that still hung around. I made my way toward the boathouse, and that's where I saw it. The aluminum canoe, half submerged at the far end of the lake, tipped on its side like a broken arm. No one else was there yet. No sign of the Cole twins. Just ripples lapping against the hull and a single red paddle caught in the reeds. I didn't want to jump to conclusions, but I knew deep down before anyone said a word. I knew something was wrong. I walked the perimeter near the dock, calling out their names, trying to keep my voice steady. No answer. A few minutes later, Ellie came running from the mess hall, her hair still damp, her shoes half-tied. She asked if I'd seen them, if maybe they'd gone down early to swim. I didn't know what to tell her. She stood there, arms crossed over her chest, staring out at that overturned canoe like it might explain something if we just waited long enough. The rest of the camp woke up fast after that. Word spread before the counselors could contain it. By 7, Mrs. Price was on the phone with the county sheriff. The older staff circled up behind the lodge, whispering. Some of the kids started crying. Others didn't understand. I was asked to help with the head count standard protocol, but my eyes kept drifting toward the water. The way it looked that morning, still and black and cold, I remember thinking if they were out there, the lake wasn't giving them back. Not easily. The sheriff showed up just after 8 with 2 deputies. They asked the usual questions: who saw them last, were there, any signs they'd planned something. Were the boys known to sneak out? I told them what I knew: the twins had always stuck close to each other, that they'd talked about doing something legendary the day before, but I hadn't thought much of it. Just 2 11-year-olds trying to impress their cabin mates. It didn't seem dangerous then. A few of us combed the grounds, checked the woods, the bunkhouses, even the maintenance shed. No shoes, no towels, no wet clothes left behind. Their beds were empty, neatly made. By mid-morning, the police had cordoned off the lakefront. A dive team arrived by early afternoon. I stood with Ellie near the dock as they slipped beneath the surface bubbles, rising in slow bursts like something exhaling beneath the water. She didn't say much, just stared at the canoe arms wrapped tight around her ribs like she was bracing for impact. I wanted to comfort her, but there wasn't anything I could offer. Not yet. I remember thinking maybe they ran off. Maybe they made it to the other side and got lost in the woods. That's what I told myself, because the alternative was worse. The alternative meant the lake had taken them. The official report came together quickly. The sheriff's office called it a likely accident. A nighttime swim gone wrong, no witnesses, no sign of foul play, Mrs. Price told the remaining campers that the boys had gone missing during the storm and that authorities were doing everything they could. A few days later, the camp was quietly shut down for the season. Families were notified. Counselors were thanked. Most of us packed our things and left. Some didn't even say goodbye. I stayed a few extra nights to help clean up. I told myself it was just to be useful, but the truth was I didn't want to leave yet. I kept hoping something would surface, that maybe they'd come walking back in, soaked and sheepish, with some story about getting turned around in the dark. But they didn't. And the lake stayed silent. The town grieved, but not loudly. People put candles in their windows for a few weeks. There were articles in the local paper, a small vigil at the school gym, a few theories tossed around in the coffee shop near Main Street. But after a while, the story started to thin out. Folks said it was just a tragedy, a fluke. They said kids do dumb things sometimes, and lakes don't always forgive. I tried to believe that too, but something never sat right with me. Back then, I still had the camp map tucked in my drawer at home. Still had my badge, too. Rookie security staff laminated and curling at the corners. I held on to those things longer than I probably should have. Part of me thought I'd need them again someday. Maybe deep down I knew we hadn't heard the last of it. It wasn't until years later, after I'd joined the sheriff's department full-time, that I started to think about the gaps. Not just the missing boys, but the missing pieces around them. The stories that didn't line up. The counselors who vanished from the records. The silence from the camp director after she moved out west. And then there was the thing I'd seen that night, the shadow across the lake. I told myself it was nothing. Just a trick of the stormlight. But the memory stuck, and the older I got, the harder it became to ignore. 3 decades passed. I married once, divorced quietly. Took a desk job, then phased into retirement. Moved farther north where the woods grow thick and the winters are quiet. I thought I'd made peace with it, thought time had dulled the edges. But then the postcard came. No signature, no explanation. Just a grainy photograph of Mirror Lake faded at the corners, and those 3 words typed in uneven ink. Come find us. That was all it took. The memory rushed back in like a tide. The smell of wet pine, the creak of the dock, the silence that followed their names. I left it sitting on the kitchen table overnight, hoping it might make more sense in the morning. It didn't. But it did come with a second call. Detective Lena Sloan from Grafton County's Cold Case Unit. She asked if I'd worked at Mirror Lake in 1987. Said the department had received something unusual, another postcard, same photograph, same message. She asked if I'd be willing to meet. Said they were reopening the case. I told her I'd be there. And as I packed a small bag and folded the old map back into my coat pocket, I found a slip of paper tucked in my wallet with a name I hadn't called in years. Ellie Cole. Her number was still scrawled in my handwriting. I dialed. The phone rang 3 times before she answered, quiet but steady. I told her something had happened. Told her I was going back. There was a long pause. Then she said, "I'll meet you there." And she did. That morning, standing by the gate, older but unmistakable. The camp was a ruin by then, caved roof weeds in the gravel, the dock sagging into the lake like it had finally given up. But the feeling hadn't changed. Something was still here, watching, waiting. Ellie walked with me to the shoreline, her boots crunching through wet leaves. We stood there in silence, side by side, staring at the lake that had taken her brothers. And neither of us had to say it aloud. We were finally ready to ask what no one had dared to ask 30 years ago. Not what the storm had hidden, but who had watched them go. That's when Detective Sloan arrived, notepad in hand, calm and clear-eyed. She told us the investigation had been reopened, said they were starting from the beginning with the night the boys disappeared, and this time they'd follow every trail no matter how cold. I didn't say much, just looked at Ellie and then back at the water. Because if someone had sent those postcards, then someone after all these years still knew the truth, and they weren't done talking. Detective Sloan started with the records, or what was left of them. The old office was a mess of warped wood and mildew, years of rot softening everything it touched. She moved carefully through it, cataloging anything still legible. Ellie stood by the window, her arms crossed tight, watching dust float in the late light like she was seeing something no one else could. I stayed by the shelf near the back, flipping through a ledger I didn't realize I still remembered. The handwriting stopped me cold. Mrs. Price's script, looping and neat. July 13th, 1987. Brandon and Bradley Cole noted as missing. A faint pencil circle drawn around their names. Nothing else. No incident report, no follow-up. Just that. Ellie said nothing, but I heard the breath catch in her throat. The silence felt familiar. Not the comfortable kind, but the one that comes when everyone in a room agrees not to speak a truth they all know. After the dive team left, we spent most of the day sorting through anything that might matter. Camp rosters, shift logs, boxes of ruined papers. Ellie found a blue folder buried behind a crate of plastic cups and tangled extension cords. She opened it slowly, like it might bite. Inside were signed permission slips, old camp newsletters, a few Polaroids, one of which she handed to me. The twins' arms around each other in the firelight, their faces lit unevenly by the flash. Brandon's expression was still like he wasn't quite sure how to pose. Bradley was grinning. Behind them, the tree line blurred into a dark smear. But if you looked closely just to the left of the fire pit, there was something else, a shape not quite formed, half swallowed by shadow. I didn't say anything at first, just slid the photo into my jacket pocket and moved on. That afternoon we sat down at one of the old dining tables with Sloan to talk through what we remembered. I told her about the rumors. The ones we used to laugh off about staff games after dark, dares whispered between cabins. It was called the Midnight Pact. Most of us thought it was just camp talk, but that summer there'd been something different. Ellie mentioned Marissa Coyle, how her brothers had looked up to her. Said Bradley once told her he'd been invited to some kind of secret club. He was proud of it. Said it meant he was finally getting noticed. Then he never brought it up again. Sloane took notes in silence, only glancing up to ask, "Do you remember any arguments among the staff?" I nodded. Derek Michaels had been confrontational. Too loud, too eager to test boundaries. He was sent home early for setting off fireworks by the lake. Or that's what they told us. But I remember hearing he came back. No one ever confirmed it. Marissa had disappeared just as suddenly. One week she was the kids' favorite counselor. The next, she was gone. No explanation. Ellie said her parents tried reaching out for months. Letters went unanswered. Phones disconnected. Eventually they gave up. But she never forgot it. Never stopped wondering. Sloane stood, walked toward the old staff bulletin board, and started peeling back layers of rotted flyers and faded notices. Underneath was a crude treasure map some camper must have drawn years ago, still thumbtacked to the wall. One of the names scrawled in the margin caught her eye. Derek plus Marissa. Doc. We stared at it in silence. Sloane took a photo, then asked to walk the trail behind the lodge again. She wanted to see where the canoes used to be stored, check for any side paths or hidden spots that might have been used for late-night meetings. The woods had reclaimed most of it, but the bones of the camp were still there if you knew where to look. The canoe shed, though sagging, still stood. We walked around it slowly, stepping over branches and damp leaves. Ellie traced her fingers along the edge of the doorway and then stopped. She told us there had been a fight the day before the twins disappeared. Brandon and Bradley arguing about something, not loud, just tense. She remembered hearing Bradley say, "You'll chicken out anyway," and Brandon whispering back, "Not this time." She'd assumed it was about swim tests. Now she wasn't so sure. We followed the path toward the water past the archery range and the broken benches where kids used to sit for skits and songs. Everything felt smaller now. Ellie paused near the dock and pointed to a cluster of stones half buried in moss. She remembered the boys used to meet there after dinner, a little out of sight, but not too far from the cabins. A few steps beyond, there was a spot where the trees broke open barely wide enough for two people to walk side by side. It led toward North Point, where the current deepened and the light never quite reached the same way. Sloane said that was where the divers would start next. If the canoe had drifted in that direction, there was a chance it wasn't an accident, that something or someone had drawn them there. As we circled back to the mess hall, Ellie asked if we could stop by cabin 7. It was still standing barely. The screen door hung off one hinge. Inside bunks lined the walls, the wood swollen from years of rain and rot. The room still smelled like pine and dust, but underneath that was something colder. We stood there for a long time. I looked at the corner where I remembered Brandon kept his flashlight. He'd won it for spotting a loon on the lake before breakfast. The counselor had written his name in faded marker on the handle COLE. It was dumb, but I half expected to find it there. Some small trace left behind. But the shelves were empty. As we left, Sloane said they'd be canvassing anyone who'd worked that summer. That included Derek Michaels and Marissa Coyle, if they could be found. I asked if she really thought anyone would talk after all this time. She said, "Sometimes it only takes one person breaking the silence." Ellie didn't answer. She just kept walking slow and steady, like her feet still remembered the path. We were almost back to the mess hall when I heard it just for a second, a sound I hadn't heard in 30 years. Laughter faint and high and wrong for the hour. Ellie froze. Sloane turned, scanning the woods. But there was nothing. No movement. No voice. Just wind brushing the tops of the trees and the faint creak of wood shifting behind us. We didn't talk about it. Not right then. But I saw the look on Ellie's face. She'd heard it too. And we both knew whatever had happened that night at Mirror Lake hadn't stayed buried. Not completely. Not yet. After that day at the cabin, I couldn't sleep. Not well. Not with the way the woods pressed in at night, not with the quiet pull of the lake every time I looked out the window. I started walking the grounds early sometimes before sunrise, just to settle my nerves. The air always felt heavier near the water, thicker somehow, like it was holding something back. Ellie stayed in town, close to the motel off Route 3. We kept in touch through short phone calls, just enough to let each other know we were still in it, still searching. Sloan called me 2 days later to say they'd pulled staff records from the county archives. Most of it had been boxed up when the camp closed down, but a few names were still legible, including Derek Michaels and Marissa Coyle. She said the Grafton County database had addresses for both, though one hadn't been current in years. I asked if either had picked up the phone. She said no, but that didn't mean they weren't listening. That same afternoon, I went back to the mess hall. I wasn't looking for anything in particular, maybe just hoping the place would feel different in the daylight. It didn't. The air was still cold inside. Sunlight slanted through the broken windows, catching dust in long, slow patterns. I sat at one of the long tables and opened the folder we'd left behind. Inside were the old rosters and my journal from that summer, somehow still intact, though the corners had gone soft and the ink had bled in places. I don't remember writing most of it, just flashes, bits of a kid trying to make sense of things beyond his understanding. But toward the back, clipped between 2 pages, was a note I didn't recognize. Folded once, yellowed at the edge. It read, "Meet us at the North Point, after lights out. Don't tell anyone. It's for the pact." My name wasn't on it. No signature. Just those words in faint type like it had been run through a cheap typewriter. I stared at it for a long time before calling Sloan. She drove out that evening, met me just after dark, flashlight in hand, and a jacket zipped high against the wind. I gave her the note. She didn't say much, just nodded and slid it into an evidence sleeve. Said she'd compare it against other materials from the case file, what little there was. I told her about the entry I'd written that night. Something about shouting near the dock. Lanterns, one red, one white. A counselor soaking wet. I hadn't realized it back then, but it must have been Marissa. I'd written that she told me to forget it, to go back to bed. At the time, I figured I'd imagined the whole thing, but reading it now, it didn't feel like a dream. It felt like something I'd buried on purpose. Sloan sat down across from me and said gently, "Sometimes kids keep secrets to protect people they trust, even when they don't know what they're protecting them from." I didn't answer. Just stared at the photograph on the table, Brandon and Bradley by the fire, smiling with something too dark behind them to name. Ellie arrived the next morning. She looked tired but clearer somehow. She said she'd been replaying things in her head. Not the day they disappeared, but the days before. Said she remembered the way counselors used to huddle at the back of the mess hall whispering. That she once heard them say the pact wasn't just a game, it was a test. Something about proving loyalty. She didn't know what it meant at the time, but it stuck with her. She said Bradley had come back from lunch one day grinning, said he'd been invited, that he couldn't talk about it yet, but it meant he was part of something. Brandon had looked uneasy. Ellie thought maybe he was nervous about getting in trouble. Now she wondered if he'd been scared. Later that afternoon, Sloan stopped by with an update. She'd tracked down Marissa's name through the DMV. Turned out she still lived in the state about 40 miles out. Sloan had left a message. No response yet, but it was something. She also said Derek's old address was now listed as vacant. No forwarding information. But she had people looking. Before she left, she handed Ellie a small zip bag. Inside was a patch frayed and faded. Cabin 7's insignia, the threads unraveling at the edges, found behind a loose panel in the floorboards. Ellie held it like it might fall apart in her hands. I didn't say anything. I just watched her trace the stitching with her thumb. That night I sat outside by the fire pit, the one from the photo. It hadn't been used in years, but the stones were still there, sunken into the dirt. I watched the sky go from gray to black, listened to the lake shift and settle. You'd think a place that had taken so much would feel louder, but it wasn't. It was quiet, like it was waiting. Just past 10, I saw headlights through the trees. A sedan. Slow. Careful. I stood and walked toward the gravel lot, heart already tight in my chest. The car stopped. A woman stepped out clutching a satchel. Her hair was shorter than I remembered, streaked with gray. But I knew her. Ellie stepped beside me and said her name aloud before I could. Marissa. She didn't speak at first, just looked past us toward the water like she was counting years by the way the trees had changed. Sloane appeared a few minutes later, calm and composed. She offered Marissa a seat, a cup of coffee. No pressure, no push, just a chance to talk. We sat at the same table where we'd found the folder. Marissa set her satchel down gently and said, "I haven't spoken about that summer since I left. I figured if anyone wanted to know, they would have asked back then." Sloane nodded and waited. Marissa's hands shook slightly as she opened the bag and pulled out an envelope. Inside were photos, letters, folded bits of notebook paper. She laid them out like she'd rehearsed it. She told us the Midnight Pact had started the year before. Staff only. Supposed to be harmless, sneaking out, doing dares, bonding rituals. But in '87, something changed. Derek had taken it further. Wanted the younger kids involved. Said it would scare them straight. That it was part of growing up. Marissa had tried to push back, said it wasn't right. But no one wanted to listen. Not when Derek had the camp's ear. She said Bradley was eager. Wanted to prove himself. Said he'd do whatever it took. Brandon had followed, because he always followed. That night they met at the canoe shed. Derek was already there. Lisa too. Another counselor, quiet, anxious. They had a second canoe ready. Marissa said she yelled at them to stop. Told Derek it was too risky, that the storm was already rolling in. But he laughed. Said it was just a game, that it would be over in 20 minutes. She watched the boys push off from the dock. Saw the two canoes drift out toward the North Point. The wind picked up fast. Then the rain. She lost sight of them. By the time she ran down to the shoreline, only Derek and Lisa had returned. Soaked, shaking. No boys. Derek said they got separated, that the twins had turned back, that they were probably fine. Lisa didn't say a word, just stared at the ground, her lips pressed tight. That was the story. That's what they stuck with. And the next day, Marissa packed her things and left. Couldn't carry it. Couldn't stay. When she finished, no one spoke. Sloane reached for the envelope and asked gently, "Would you be willing to give a formal statement?" Marissa nodded once. Said, "If it helps. I don't want to carry it anymore." Ellie looked down at the patch in her hand, then back at Marissa. She didn't say thank you. She didn't have to. Outside, the wind shifted, a low rustle through the trees, and somewhere out on the lake a loon called long and low, a sound that settled into the silence like it had always been waiting there. I didn't know what the next day would bring, but something had cracked open, not in the lake, in the silence around it. And whatever had stayed buried that night in 1987, it wasn't going to stay that way much longer. The next morning, I got to the camp early. The fog hadn't lifted yet, and the trees looked like they were holding their breath. I stood at the shoreline for a long time, staring out past the dock where the water went dark just a few feet from shore. I couldn't see the North Point, not clearly, but I knew that's where we were heading. The dive team was due to arrive by 9. Ellie pulled up a little after me, still quiet, but steadier than she'd been the day before. She stood beside me, arms crossed, jacket zipped high. We didn't speak, just listened to the sound of the lake brushing against the pilings and the wind moving through the reeds. When the sheriff's truck finally pulled in behind us, I felt something shift. Not relief, not yet, but maybe momentum. Detective Sloan stepped out with her usual calm, already on the phone with someone from the county lab. She gave a nod in our direction and walked down to the dock, pointing to the deeper water near the Old North Pier. 2 divers in dry suits followed, checking their gear as they moved, not saying much. A deputy clipped the caution tape across the trail behind us, more for protocol than need. No one was coming up here who didn't already know what this place held. By the time the first diver went in, the fog had started to lift, curling back from the surface in slow ribbons. The second followed close behind, carrying a sonar unit tethered to the shore team. Ellie kept her eyes on the water, not blinking. I watched the ripples expand outward and then vanish. The lake looked calm, but I knew better now. Sloan stood with her notebook open, jotting dates, coordinates, initials. I didn't ask what she was writing. I could feel the weight of it. 20 minutes passed before the first diver resurfaced, slow and careful. Something clutched in his hand, a mesh bag. He handed it off to the shore deputy, then climbed up the ladder. Sloan walked over as the bag was unzipped. Inside was a rusted padlock, old, corroded, but with the words Mirror Lake Camp still just visible on the face. Next to it, a flashlight. Small, yellow. One of the plastic kinds we used to hand out for merit badges. It had a sticker on the side, faded and peeling, but part of a name still showed through. C-O-L-E. Ellie stepped forward before anyone could stop her. She dropped to her knees in the mud and picked it up with both hands. Her shoulders didn't shake. She didn't cry. She just held it to her chest like something she'd been waiting decades to feel again. Raymond. She said he loved this thing. He won it for spotting a loon on the first day. Wouldn't let it out of his sight. The divers went back in. The water swallowed them without a sound. I turned away and started walking the shoreline, eyes scanning the moss and stones, though I didn't expect to find anything. I just needed to move. Ellie joined me a few minutes later, her boots sinking into the soft earth beside mine. We followed the path as far as the broken canoe shed the one the boys had slipped through the night they vanished. The door was gone now, collapsed inward like the whole thing had folded in on itself. She reached down and touched one of the crossbeams. I used to watch them from here, she said. They'd always race to the dock after dinner, always together. I nodded but didn't speak. There wasn't much to say that hadn't already been buried here. An hour passed before the divers surfaced again. This time one of them called out before he even hit the ladder. Sloan moved quickly, motioning for the deputy to get the collection kit. When they opened the bag, there was something small inside. A bracelet. The kind you make at camp, colored beads strung on a cord, the plastic already brittle with age. The letters were faded but still legible, B&B 1987. Ellie took it with both hands like it might fall apart. Bradley made this, she said, for Brandon. They wouldn't take them off. Sloan knelt beside her and placed a hand lightly on her shoulder. These things survived, she said. There may be more. It was around noon when one of the deputies walked down from the road and said a visitor had arrived. Said her name was Marissa Coyle. Ellie and I exchanged a glance, then headed up toward the gravel lot. She was waiting near the tree line, her coat zipped up, one hand gripping the strap of a leather satchel. Her hair was shorter than I remembered, but her face hadn't changed. When she saw us, she didn't speak, just nodded once, like she already knew why she was there. Sloan met her halfway, introduced herself, and walked her down to the mess hall where the table had become a kind of temporary evidence station. Everything we'd found, photos, rosters, the flashlight, the bracelet, was laid out in clear bags across the surface. Marissa stared at them for a long time before sitting down. Her voice was low when she finally spoke. I haven't talked about that summer in decades, she said. Not to anyone. I left because I couldn't carry it. I thought if someone wanted to know, they'd ask, but no one ever did. Sloan let her speak at her own pace. Marissa told us about the pact, How it had started as a bonding ritual between staff, innocent at first, night swims, pranks, but in '87 Derek wanted to push it further, said it was time the younger campers earned their place, said the boys were ready, Bradley especially. He wanted to be seen. Derek told them if they made it to North Point after lights out and brought back a paddle, they'd be legends. Marissa said she tried to stop them. Argued with Derek, but he wouldn't listen, said it was tradition. She saw the boys slip out of cabin 7. She followed, watched them take the canoe. Derek and Lisa were already in another circling behind. It started out as a game. Lights flashing, kids laughing, but then the storm rolled in. Fast. Loud. She saw Brandon lose his paddle, heard the splash. Then the shouting stopped. The lanterns flickered. The canoes disappeared into the dark. When she got back to shore, Derek and Lisa were standing there, soaked silent. No boys. Lisa was crying. Derek told her to stay quiet, said no one would believe it wasn't their fault, said it was better for everyone if they said nothing. She said she believed him, at least for a while, until the news broke the next morning and the search ended too soon. She couldn't take it, packed her things, left the next day, never came back, until now. No one spoke for a long time. Sloane finally asked if she'd give a formal statement. Marissa nodded, said she would, said it was time. I looked down at the flashlight on the table, the bracelet curled beside it. I didn't recognize the feeling in my chest. It wasn't closure, not yet, but it was movement, something we hadn't had in 30 years. And then Sloane said quietly, "We'll find them. We'll bring them home." Outside, the wind shifted. The trees moved in a long, slow wave. And just past the broken dock where the divers still moved beneath the surface, the lake held steady, like it had been waiting for someone to ask the right question. Or maybe the right person to finally answer it. That evening, after the divers packed up and Sloane headed back to the station with Marissa's statement, I couldn't bring myself to leave. Ellie stayed too. We sat in the old staff office with a thermos of coffee between us, the kind that tastes more like tin than anything else. She pulled out a notebook she'd been keeping filled with sketches and bits of memory, things the boys used to say, places they used to go. A drawing of the fire pit from memory. At some point she looked up and said, "There was another building, wasn't there? Past the creek. The one they never let the campers near." I knew what she meant. The maintenance shed. Most of us just called it the tool shed. Off-limits locked up, but every counselor had a key, and some of them used it for more than tools. I hadn't thought about it in years, but once she said it, I could see it clearly. Rusted siding, a warped door that never closed right, and a narrow path winding behind it that led nowhere in particular. I stood up, grabbed my flashlight, and said, "Let's go." The path was barely visible under the leaf cover, but the shed itself was still there, slouched against the trees, half swallowed by vines. The padlock had been cut long ago. Someone had been through it before. Inside, it smelled like dirt and motor oil. A broken lawnmower sat in one corner. A line of shelves ran along the back, most of them empty except for rusted tools and some rotted canvas tarps. Ellie moved slowly, running her fingers across the wall like she was trying to feel something before she saw it. She paused near the back and pointed. There, carved into the wood, were initials BC and RC, stacked one above the other. "Brandon and Raymond," she said, almost to herself. They were here. I leaned in and saw something else beneath the carving. A faint outline, a square in the wall where the wood looked slightly darker, cleaner. A panel. I tapped the edge with the flashlight. Hollow. We pulled it open. Behind it was a crawl space, small, just wide enough to fit a person lying down. Inside, someone had laid a folded blanket and an old lantern battery missing. There was a shoebox wedged in the far corner. Ellie reached for it and opened it slowly. Inside were scraps, bits of paper, a small compass, a wrapper from a candy bar, and a photo. This one we hadn't seen before. The boys again. Only this time they weren't smiling. Brandon looked straight at the camera, Sirius his arm tight around his brother's shoulder. Bradley looked off to the side like something had pulled his attention. Behind them I saw the edge of the dock, and in the far background, just barely visible through the blur, was Derek. I took the photo and slid it into my jacket pocket. We didn't stay much longer. There wasn't anything else in that crawl space but dust and silence, but it felt like something had been left there for a reason. Back at the mess hall, we spread out everything we'd found so far. The flashlight, the bracelet, the carved initials, and now this photo. Sloane arrived just before midnight, her eyes drawn and tired but still sharp. We showed her what we'd found. She asked if the shed had been disturbed. I said no, just old dust and old air. She picked up the photo and stared at it for a long time. "That's him," she said. "That's Derek. This confirms he was with them that night." She sat down and pulled a file from her bag. Inside was a printed email thread. Apparently someone had tried to file a complaint against Derek in '89, a camper's parent. Said her son came home from Mirror Lake with bruises. Said he was afraid of the dark. The case was closed without follow-up. No charges, no statement, just logged and buried. Sloane said they'd reopened it that morning. Ellie asked if they'd been able to reach Lisa, the other counselor from that night. Sloane said they had. She was living in Oregon now under a different last name. Married, 2 kids. She'd agreed to speak with investigators in the next few days. That felt important, like another knot coming loose. But then Sloane looked back down at the photo and her brow furrowed. She pointed to the background, not at Derek, but past him. "Do you see that?" she asked. I leaned in. Between the trees, faint, but there was a shape. Human height, but not clear, not moving. Just there. Ellie said quietly. "I saw that same shape in the Polaroid from the fire pit." Sloane nodded. So did I. She took both photos and held them side by side under the lamp. Same outline, same position in the frame, different nights, different cameras. I felt a chill crawl down the back of my neck, and for once I knew it wasn't the weather. We didn't talk much after that. Everyone was too tired, too heavy with the weight of everything that was starting to surface. Ellie walked back to her room around 1. Sloane made calls from her car headlights off, her voice low and steady. I stayed in the mess hall watching the lantern on the table flicker, casting long shadows against the far wall. Around 2, I stood and walked outside, flashlight in hand, drawn without thinking toward the North Trail. The woods were quiet. Too quiet, the kind of silence that pushes in around you like water. I followed the path to the place where the ground bends, where the trees open just enough to see the lake. I thought I saw something move near the dock, a figure just for a second. I stepped closer, but by the time my flashlight reached the edge, it was gone. Nothing but fog rolling low across the surface. I turned back slowly. Didn't run, just walked. By morning, Sloane had news. A utility worker who used to service the camp's generator back in the '80s had come forward. Said he'd found something strange one night, an old trap door behind the mess hall. Said it had been sealed shut with bolts from the inside. At the time, he didn't think much of it, just figured it was storage. But after hearing about the boys, about the search at Mirror Lake, he called it in. Said he never forgot the sound it made when he knocked. Said it didn't sound empty. Ellie and I followed Sloane to the back of the building. The grass was overgrown, the ground soft. She pointed to a patch of earth near the rear steps. "We'll excavate tomorrow," she said. "But if that door's still down there, we might be closer than we thought." She turned back toward the parking lot, already dialing in the request for a forensics team. I stayed a moment longer staring at that patch of earth, trying to picture what it might have looked like 3 decades earlier, before the vines, before the silence, before all of this hardened into memory. And I thought of that shape in the photographs. Still, watching, always just behind them. And I wondered if beneath all of this there was still something waiting to be found, or someone. By the time the sun rose, the backlot behind the mess hall had already been marked with caution tape. 2 forensics vans pulled in just after 7, followed by Sloan and a pair of state investigators I hadn't met before, both serious, quiet types. Ellie and I stood back near the tree line as the team unpacked their gear, laid out tarps, set up lighting. Even in daylight, the patch of earth they'd flagged looked off, too level, too smooth, like someone had taken time to make it look forgotten. It didn't take long. The first trowel hit wood around 9, old boards damp but intact. A corner of metal hinge beneath the surface rusted deep. Sloan crouched beside it, gloved hands brushing away the dirt with slow, deliberate care. One of the techs checked the latch. It wasn't locked, just stuck. 2 of them worked the edge loose with a crowbar, and when the door finally gave it, let out a low groan like something exhaled from underneath. I'll never forget that sound. A narrow set of steps led down into darkness. The air that came out was cold and stale, thick with the smell of mildew and thyme. One of the techs dropped a light down, then followed with a camera. Sloan waited at the top radio, crackling softly at her hip. Then the voice came back low, firm. "You're going to want to see this." They moved slowly. It wasn't a large space, maybe 10 feet by 12. Poured concrete, unfinished walls, one single bulb socket above that hadn't held power in decades. In the far corner, a cot. Metal frame, the kind you'd see in an old clinic. The mattress had rotted out, but you could still see the shape of it where someone had slept, or been kept. Next to it, a rusted bucket, a crate with empty food cans, and on the wall, carved deep into the concrete with what looked like a screwdriver, were 4 words. We were still here. Ellie turned away, hand over her mouth. Sloan stepped in beside her, silent. No one spoke. They set up a dehumidifier, pulled soil samples, photographed every inch. But we all knew what it was. Not a storm that took the boys, not an accident. Someone brought them down here. Someone kept them here. The remains weren't in that room, but the presence was, thick, heavy, like the walls still held it. Later that afternoon, Lisa arrived. She'd flown in from Oregon, escorted by a local officer who met her at the airport. She was nervous, couldn't stop rubbing her hands together, but when she saw the photo we'd found in the shed, something in her changed. Not panic, not fear, just resignation. She sat down with Sloan in the ranger station and started talking. Said Derek had a key to that trap door. Said it was never part of camp use. Not even the grounds crew touched it. It was his spot, he said. A storm shelter, maybe. Lisa never went down there, not once, but she remembered the night of the twins. She remembered Derek saying, "We'll wait it out. Let 'em feel scared. Then we'll go get 'em." She thought he meant on the water. She didn't know he'd already pulled them from the canoe, that he'd led them down there. The next morning, while Sloan filed the warrant and state police started tracking Derek's last known address, Ellie and I returned to the North Point. I don't know why. Maybe to see if the lake felt different now that we knew. It didn't. It still watched. Still held everything it had seen. I walked the shoreline, boots slipping on wet stones, and found myself at the tree where the old dock had once anchored. Something stuck out of the mud metal thin. I knelt and brushed it clear. A belt buckle, worn smooth. I held it up, turned it in the light. The initials BC, scratched faintly on the back. Ellie crouched beside me, tears in her eyes for the first time since the bracelet. "That's his," she said. "He used to sneak it from our dad's closet." Back at the station, Sloan got a hit. Derek was living under a different name now, David Renshaw, somewhere in upstate New York. A rented cabin near Lake Ontario, retired carpenter. No kids, no record. The local sheriff's department agreed to make the approach. Ellie wanted to come. Sloan said no. I stayed behind with her as the call came in. Entry made suspect taken into custody without incident. But the part that stopped me cold was this: when they brought him out, he didn't ask why. Didn't protest. Just said, "Took you long enough." Like he'd been waiting. They found boxes in his basement. Old camp rosters, letters, a whistle with a cracked mouthpiece. Dozens of photos, campers, counselors, some taken from high up in trees. Most disturbing was a notebook filled with dates and names, like a log. Many were crossed out. Some had stars. On the page for July 1987, 2 names, Brandon and Bradley. No crossout. Just one word beside each mine. I looked at that page for a long time after the file was released. The handwriting was small, almost childlike. Neat, deliberate. I don't know if he kept them down there for hours or days. I don't know when they died, but I know they were taken and that he never meant for them to leave. The boys were never found. The room beneath the mess hall held no remains, but the earth around it did. Bone fragments, 2 sets, matched by DNA 2 weeks later. The Cole twins had never made it past their first week at camp. Ellie stood by the water that night, flashlight off, just her and the dark. I stayed a few steps back, letting her have whatever it was she needed from the lake. At one point, she turned and said, "Do you think they knew I was still looking?" I didn't have an answer. Just stood there with her until the wind shifted and the moon cleared and the water rippled like something had moved underneath. Not a threat. Not anymore. Just memory stirred loose, waiting to be honored, waiting to be told. They transferred Derek to county lockup just before dawn. There were no press crews waiting, no sirens, no spectacle. Just 2 deputies, the cold of early October, and a man who didn't say a word as they walked him out of that cabin and into the back of the cruiser. He kept his eyes low the whole time, except once when he glanced over his shoulder toward the woods. I saw it from the still frame in the report. It wasn't fear. It wasn't remorse. Just awareness. Like he knew those woods had held on to more than anyone realized. They booked him under his legal alias, David Renshaw, but within the hour, the real name was reinstated in the system: Derek Carson, former counselor, Camp Mirror Lake, 1987. Charges were filed the next day. 2 counts of felony kidnapping, 2 counts of murder in the first degree, unlawful disposal of human remains, endangering the welfare of a child, and that was just the start. Word traveled fast. Parents who'd lost their boys came forward to submit new DNA samples. Others who'd been at the camp that summer, kids now in their 40s and 50s, called in to describe memories they'd buried for decades. One woman said she remembered Derek pulling her aside during arts and crafts, telling her she was too loud and needed to learn stillness. Another described a game he ran in the woods at dusk, one that always left her alone and disoriented. None of it had made sense then. But now, piece by piece, the image of a predator hiding behind the structure of summer camp started to form. Lisa gave a formal deposition. So did Ellie. I didn't testify, but I stayed close to the case, watching as the prosecution built their timeline from the inside out. Derek had been removed from Camp Mirror Lake staff in 1988, quietly with no formal reprimand, just reassigned to a different location in another county. The camp director who signed off on the transfer had since passed away. No paper trail, no consequences. Just a system that buried what it couldn't bear to face. It took 4 months to reach arraignment. Derek pleaded not guilty. His attorney claimed age, memory loss, a history of mental illness. But the evidence was there. The photos, the journal, the location of the hidden cellar. The remains matched to the Cole twins. The judge denied bail. In the meantime, the camp was officially shut down. The property, which had been up for seasonal rentals, was reclaimed by the state for environmental review. All public access was suspended. Sloan handed in her report and stepped down from the task force, said she needed time to process. I understood. None of us came out of this the same. Ellie spent weeks with her parents in Ohio. I stayed in town helping catalog the physical evidence for transfer to state records. Late one night, I went back to the shed. Alone. I shouldn't have, but I needed to see it again to make sure it was still there. The crawl space, the initials, the shoebox we'd left untouched. I opened it again and found something I hadn't seen the first time tucked behind the lining, a folded scrap of yellow paper barely larger than a matchbook. In a child's hand it said, "He said you wouldn't come." I took it straight to Sloan the next morning. She read it twice, then slid it into a sealed bag without a word. We didn't need to guess what it meant. Somewhere in the timeline the boys must have believed someone would find them. And somewhere along the line they stopped believing it. That truth, more than anything else, settled into my bones like cold water. Not just what was done to them, but what they were made to feel in those last hours. Forgotten. The state attorney's office moved quickly after that. Given the age of the case and the gravity of the findings, they pushed for a plea deal. Derek accepted. Life without parole with full admission of guilt in exchange for closing the case without trial. He signed the statement. Gave a flat, emotionless recounting of the night. Said he took the boys off the lake after they acted out, led them back to camp, told them it was punishment, said he left them in the cellar for a day or two, claimed he brought them food, claimed one of them was already unwell, refused to say more, said the details didn't matter anymore. When asked why he did it, he gave no answer, just silence. Then the sound of a pen scratching across the page. He was moved to a maximum security facility in New York. No interviews permitted, no visitation beyond legal counsel. It should have ended there. But stories like this never really end. A month after the plea, Ellie asked if I'd meet her at the lake one last time. She was leaving town for good, heading west, starting over, but she wanted to stand there again before she did. We walked the trail in silence, stopped by the tree line where the old dock had been. She pulled something from her pocket. A locket. Inside was the photo we'd found in the crawl space, Brandon and Bradley arms around each other looking somewhere just past the camera. She knelt and buried it at the water's edge, said a few words I couldn't hear. When she stood up, she looked lighter. Not healed, not whole, but no longer carrying it alone. I stayed behind after she left. The wind had picked up rustling through the leaves in low bursts. Somewhere across the lake, an owl called. And for the first time in months, I didn't feel watched. Just present. Still. Like the story had been told, and the silence that followed was finally earned. Some nights, I still hear the water. Not the crash of waves, but the hush, the kind of sound a lake makes when it's holding something underneath. There's no mystery in it anymore, no speculation. We know what happened. The boys were taken. The ones who should have protected them didn't. And the silence that followed for years was as much a part of the harm as anything Derek Carson did. But now that silence is broken, their names are spoken again, and there's power in that. After the sentencing, I kept in touch with Sloan off and on. She never went back into law enforcement. Last I heard, she was helping build a program for families of cold case victims, helping them navigate systems that were never built to hold this kind of pain. Ellie did leave town, like she said, sent a letter once from Montana, said the air there felt wider, like nothing had touched it, said she could sleep through the night. That meant more than anything a courtroom could have handed down. As for me, I stayed, not out of duty, just because this is where it happened. And I don't think the land forgets even when we do. The camp property was returned to the county in the spring. The structures were removed, trees planted where the cabins stood. The mess hall and that cellar beneath it, they're gone now, sealed, filled, buried beneath native grass and stone. It won't be a memorial officially, but it doesn't need a plaque. Those of us who know, know. And for those who come later, the quiet will speak for itself. There are things we carry with us after something like this, not all of it grief. Some of it's sharper than that. Guilt, anger, the ache of what could have been done sooner. But in time, if we're lucky, those things settle. They don't disappear, but they change shape. What used to feel like weight starts to feel like witness. We remember not because it hurts, but because it matters, because it has to matter. I keep the original camp roster in a box in my desk, not because I need to look at it, but because I need to know it's there. Every summer, new names come in, new kids on new trips. I help train guides now, not formally, just enough to say, keep your eyes open. Listen when someone says they're scared. And if something feels wrong, even if you can't explain it, pay attention. Because the worst things don't always show up with sirens. Sometimes they show up with a clipboard and a smile. Brandon and Bradley Cole were 12 years old. They loved fireflies, hated oatmeal, and made up games with secret rules only they understood. They were loud. They were kind. They were just beginning. And someone decided that wasn't enough to keep them safe. So now it's up to the rest of us to remember what was lost and to do better with what remains. If this story stayed with you, consider sharing it. So the next time someone goes missing, we don't wait years to listen. We start right then, and we don't stop.